So we're right at the halfway point of our 32 class study of Vipassana introspective insight into the three marks of existence. And this is the third of three talks on suttas related to dukkha. First, we had the Dukkha Sutta itself. And then last week, we reviewed the Dukkhakkhandha Sutta, the greater discourse on dukkha. And this week, we're reviewing the Cula-Dukkhakkhandha Sutta, the lesser discourse on dukkha, the Cula-Dukkhakkhandha Sutta. So the title, Dukkhakkhandha, khanda is a Sanskrit / Pali word that means heap or the stump of a tree, and it also means the five clinging aggregates. We heap these aggregates together and decide that that's a self. The five clinging aggregates, or the five skandhas or khandhas, simply describe the ongoing personal experience of dukkha. So putting those two together in a title is the Buddha's clear teaching that suffering is an individual, impersonal experience. I'm going to read the introduction to this sutta too, even though you probably all read it earlier today.
Yes.
Yes. See? Very good. Now you're going to hear it again. The Cula-Dukkhakkhandha Sutta is similar to the Dukkhakkhandha Sutta in subject matter and in certain sections nearly identical in language. In both suttas, the Buddha is responding to questions regarding the contradictions between his Dhamma and common dharmas of his time. And again, the significant difference between what the Buddha taught and other dharmas of his time and continuing to today is just this. The Buddha teaches a profound understanding of the nature of stress. Most everything else is in some ways how to manage or escape stress. Significantly different, and that's all personalized. The Buddha teaches that developing the profound and liberating understanding of the true nature of individual contributions to stress and suffering, dukkha, is the distinguishing factor between his Dhamma and common spiritual disciplines of his time. In other words, to say that is the Buddha teaches a very rigorous way, a very authentic way of taking responsibility for our own suffering, rather than putting it on some outside agency or some misfortune of fate. It's entirely up to us. It's not an accident. There's nothing personal about it. As with all of the Buddha's Dhamma, it is a development of true and useful vipassana, true and useful introspective insight into individual clinging of fabricated views to impermanent phenomena, and it's that results in stress and suffering. As shown in both of these suttas, last week's and this, the resolution and renunciation of ignorant views occurs through specific understanding developed through the Eightfold Path. That's why the Buddha taught the Eightfold Path. On the chart, you can see that's the Eightfold Path is intended to interrupt the process rooted in ignorance that ends with stress and suffering, dependent origination. Is that clear? Mm-hmm. That's the soul Dhamma, which is his cousin Mahanama, that the common manifestations of an individual human beings of stress is greed, aversion, and deluded thinking, always referred to as the three defilements. The common belief that practice will result in the cessation of stress and suffering, which is really just any faith-based belief, is that as long as you are faithful to the faith, as long as if you have a very strong belief and you don't really need much else, that's enough to have all your difficulties resolved, whether it's in this life or as a reward in a future life for all the good things you did in this life. The Buddha wasn't interested in that. He never discounted it. He just said it's a distraction. By believing in that or doing things and taking actions in that way distracts one from living their life. The Buddha taught a way to achieve lasting peace and happiness right here, right now, with a mind united in its body in this life, in this moment, not as a reward for anything from an external agency. The reward is our own understanding of the nature of stress and suffering. Somebody's doing, I can't read it, but the Buddha teaches that that wishing, hoping, speculating, and maintaining unexamined beliefs fabricated by ignorance of Four Noble Truths is simply a misguided, misinformed, and cruel distraction from understanding those Four Noble Truths. The reference to sensuality must be understood in the context established in the Paticcasamuppada Sutta, the Sutta on Dependent Origination, and the fabricated views corrupting the individual experience of contact with impermanent phenomena at the sixth sense base. The lesser discourse on Dukkha, the Cula-Dukkhakkhandha Sutta. And we're going to do this in two parts as well. On one occasion, the Buddha was staying with the Sakyans. The Sakyans are simply the Buddha's tribe, the group that he grew up with and was born into. The Sakyans in the banyan grove at Kapilavatthu. Mahanama, Siddhartha Gautama's cousin, approached the Buddha, bowed, and sat to one side. Mahanama had a question for his cousin and teacher. I understand your Dhamma teaches three defilements of the mind. Greed is a defilement of the mind, aversion is a defilement of the mind, and deluded thinking is a defilement of the mind. Even though I understand your Dhamma in this manner, greed, aversion, and deluded thinking invade my mind and remain. When I realize this, the thought follows, what quality do I continue to cling to when greed, aversion, and deluded thinking invade my mind and remain? That the question that Mahanama is asking shows a great understanding of the Dhamma, even though he's still troubled by thoughts rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. He has developed the framework of the Eightfold Path enough to realize this. And we talked a lot about this on our past retreat. The Dhamma isn't about being awakened so much as it's recognizing where we are and where we need to get to. And this particular sutta speaks to that, as do most suttas, to recognize where we are. It's so important to recognize and accept whatever level or lack of development or lack of development that we have right now. Another way that I say that directly is to be gentle with ourselves. If we start judging ourselves harshly for the simple fact that we have to develop the Dhamma, we're obviously stuck in a wrong view, aren't we? There's no harsh judgment of ourselves in the Buddha's Dhamma. There's simply recognition of where we're at. The Buddha responds, Mahanama, it is the very qualities of greed, aversion, and deluded thinking that you continue to cling to. In other words, if you're still feeling greed, aversion, and deluded thinking, that's what you're clinging to. That's what you're maintaining. When any of these qualities arise in you, it is due to continued clinging to these qualities. And so as human beings with autonomous thinking, we can decide to cling to anything we want. And once we create an identity to those things, we are going to cling to that because that's us. And that identity always grows out of the things we want to identify with and the things we want to avoid, greed, aversion. And all of that is rooted in what? Ignorance of Four Noble Truths or deluded thinking. So all of the difficulties that humanity has, but now we're talking about it as individuals, are resolved within that little basket of greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. And that little basket resides where? Somebody.
Internally.
Yes.
Fabrication.
So it can only be addressed internally. Let me skip over. Yes.
In the context of the defilements of deluded thinking, can you clarify that?
I'm sorry.
On the context of the defilements, can you?
What is deluded thinking?
Well, not what is, but in that context, what is Buddha getting at?
Any thought that I need to have something or avoid something to make myself safe, secure, or happy is a deluded thought. Now I'm going to ask you, do you understand that? Or do you see yourself gaining that understanding?
I see myself gaining that understanding.
Okay.
But not fully.
The difficulty is with all of our thoughts are self-referential. We really spend a lot of time on retreat. I'm just saying that because those who are on retreat or know what I'm saying. Those that weren't, forget it. This is a key part of the Dhamma. It's because we don't understand the nature of the world we live in, as described by Four Noble Truths, that every thought that follows from that is a deluded thought. And so think about that. If you're in a, say you're taking a college course on Middle Eastern politics, but your impetus or your interest is learning, give me a subject. Cooking. And you're going with that mindset that I need to learn how to flip pancakes and make good burgers and season things just right. And you enter this class and they're talking about all kinds of politics, but you're insistent on learning how to cook. You're going to take what the professor is teaching you and you're going to twist it around in such a way that you can make a good omelet out of it. And I'm using a ridiculous example, but that's what we're doing with the truth. We're taking the truth, the Four Noble Truths, and we're twisting it around so we can make our own omelets out of it. Is that clear? That's the deluded thing. That's a deluded way of thinking. We're trying to make something out of information that doesn't support what we're trying to make, which is an understanding of self. And because we do that, any thought that flows from that, while I'm sitting in the classroom of Middle Eastern politics and I'm stuck on learning how to cook an egg, I'm lost, aren't I? Because if I'm really stuck in that view, again, I'm going to keep manufacturing views that fit what I want rather than what's actually occurring. And I'm using two very distinct subjects just to make that point. It's deluded to even be sitting in that classroom, isn't it? With a deluded mind, it's deluded just to be sitting within that delusion and expecting something different. What's that saying? Doing the same thing over again. The definition of insanity, doing the same things over again, expecting the same results, different results. We do that to ourselves, and we wonder, why is life like this? Why do I keep making these choices and I still end up with disappointing experiences? Why? It's because my initial point of view is wrong. That's all it is. I don't understand Four Noble Truths. And that leads to deluded thinking and deluded decisions. So an important question. Did that help a little bit?
Yes.
Good. The Buddha continues, it is only when these qualities, greed, aversion, and deluded thinking, it is only when these qualities are not abandoned within you that you continue to be entangled in worldly affairs and you continue to cling to sensuality. So the reason why this is number 3 in our list of suttas on dukkha is just that. When you find yourself caught up in the world again, when you feel like your Dhamma practice isn't working right now, this sutta teaches you is because there's an aspect of greed, aversion, or deluded thinking present right now. That's all we need to know. If we get into why or where or how, we're just as lost as we were the moment we came across that deluded thought. It's enough to know it because we know how to end it. It's not through analysis. It's not through joining with it. It's not through embracing our stress and suffering or our ignorant thoughts. It's through the Eightfold Path.
John?
Yes.
Isn't just being disappointed in how your practice is going delusion?
Well, yes, but there's a fine line there. There's wisdom and understanding that I have a little bit more to go, and maybe I engaged in wrong speech here. Let me be mindful of it so I don't do it again. It's another thing to beat yourself up over that. You know, so we can take the non-judgmental, we had a discussion about this, just using the word, the word disappointment has an inherent personalization to it, doesn't it? But it's also possible to be disappointed just period, without any me in it. Meaning I recognize that there's something within me that I still need to recognize and abandon to continue with Dhamma practice.
Within the framework of the Eightfold Path, then you would have an understanding that it's not goal-oriented.
Yes. And again, that's where the Eightfold Path comes in and takes the passion out of awakening or escaping our suffering, because it's just this. We're just engaging in this moment. I'm not working my Dhamma right now so I'm better tomorrow. It's simply what I'm doing in this present moment as best as I can. That's quite a different mindset, isn't it?
It also takes the passion out of finding yourself in wrong view.
Yeah. You just happen to find this is where I am. That's it. And remember, even within Dhamma practice, as we're recognizing what needs to be abandoned and developing what should be developed, there's no me in it at all. There's no me in awakening either, by the way. This is not me. This is not mine. This is not myself. Michael.
And finding yourself in that state, let's say, frustration, so I would say, okay, not moving forward the way you would like to, or understand as you would like to, or not progressing as you would like to.
Mhm.
Wouldn't that also be self-referential?
Yeah, but again, there's a subtle aspect there. It more than likely is, but if it's simply just a recognition that I'm not quite there yet, that's fine. And again, we could get way too analytical about even this, about the recognition part of the Dhamma. Recognize it, whatever it is that's arising in this moment. If it doesn't fit within the framework of the Eightfold Path, you simply abandon it. Because if you don't, if you fall back into figuring out where it came from, or why am I doing this, or how come I'm so stupid or bad, or I can't do all of that stuff is simply part of Anatta. It's part of the 5 clinging aggregates. It's part of wrong views of self. Getting into it at all doesn't help. It's just a continued distraction. I recognize what's occurring right now. It's not in accordance with the Eightfold Path. Now I'm back in my body. That's it. Because if we just keep massaging that thought or falling back into the thought of why am I still doing this, you're always going to be doing it. In the moment we recognize it, come back to the sensation of breathing, and in the next moment the same issue might arise. And if we, as best as we can, that's where we practice our Dhamma. And just to say something, if we're working on an issue that seems to keep coming up, and we keep bringing this into the framework of the Eightfold Path right now as I'm sitting here and contemplating it, and it just doesn't seem to dissipate, take a breath and go take a walk, go do something else, really, because then you're pushing too hard for it. Most of the insight and abandoning of wrong views happens gradually as we're simply living the Dhamma, and we recognize things that are very subtle in the moment, and we simply let them go. And there's a lot of letting go that we don't even notice. It's just part of it. It's like when you grow from 2 to 5, it's a dramatic 3 years of growth, isn't it? You don't really recognize it. Looking back, you can a little bit, maybe, if you got a great memory. I don't really remember much. Most of our growth, even within the Dhamma, is the same way. We don't recognize it as it's happening, but we do recognize it by the way we're living our life. We're much more peaceful. We're much more present. We see it working. And that's the way it is. It is only when these qualities are abandoned within you that you remain disentangled with worldly affairs and you no longer cling to sensuality, when they're abandoned within us. So if we're still struggling with it, it's simply that. There's simply more work to do. Even though a skillful disciple understands the stress, the despair, the drawback of sensual indulgence, if they have not developed concentration and pleasure apart from sensual indulgence and unskillful mindfulness, or an even deeper level of jhana and peacefulness, they can still be distracted by sensuality. I'm going to read it again. If they have not developed concentration and pleasure apart from sensual indulgence, where's that pleasure apart from sensual indulgence developed in the Dhamma? Anyone?
John.
Hey, boy, great. Yeah, that's it. That's what the Buddha is referring to. And that's the pleasure we should be hoping to develop. It's skillful. I'm taking pleasure in the fact that my concentration is increasing, and I'm developing a profound understanding of the Eightfold Path. That's the one thing we should take pleasure in, rather than another piece of chocolate cake. Or an even deeper level of jhana and peacefulness. They can still be distracted by sensuality. So while we're diligently practicing the Dhamma, at any point we can still be distracted by sensual indulgence. That's why that aspect of the Dhamma, practicing wise restraint at the point of contact, is what we should be holding in mind. Because again, that's where we practice it. When we find ourselves distracted by sensuality, come back into our body, come back into our minds, take a breath and just recognize what's occurring. Recognize that I'm distracted by my own sensuality. And sensuality in this sense is anything that's internally distracting in my thoughts. Because our thoughts are the ultimate sensual indulgence. And I won't get too deep into that. But those of us that can become enamored with the way they're thinking,
Yeah.
that's a sensual indulgence. Yeah. It's an act of It's actually a very powerful act of greed that gets very self-referential. I don't want to get too deep into the Nagara Sutta, but it's right there within the Nagara Sutta, the Buddha's description of that feedback loop. The Buddha continues, the skillful disciple who develops the framework and guidance of the Eightfold Path will develop wise restraint and will continually lessen their craving for and clinging to sensual indulgence and sensual distraction. But when a skillful disciple understands the stress, the despair, the drawback of sensual indulgence, if they have developed concentration, it's a big if they have developed concentration. Again, the Buddha emphasized this so often, and we spent a lot of time on retreat about the importance of using meditation for concentration. This is why. And the Buddha emphasizes it over and over again, because he recognized then, just as it is now, there's an endless types of meditation or so-called meditation methods. The one the Buddha taught is specific for deepening our concentration. And this is why. If they have developed concentration and pleasure apart from sensual indulgence and unskillful mindfulness, or an even deeper level of jhana and peacefulness, they cannot be distracted by sensuality. Friend, before my own self-awakening, when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, that's one line, let me go back to it. When I was still an unawakened, or my own self-awakening, the Buddha says that thousands and thousands of times, and there's no real way to count how many times he refers to himself as rightly self-awakening and saying, this is what I teach others to do, meaning become rightly self-awakened. There's no external agency working on us, rightly self-awakened. And when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, I came to the understanding with right view that sensual indulgence is stressful. It brings despair. It has drawbacks. But as long as I had not developed concentration and pleasure apart from sensual indulgence and unskillful mindfulness, or an even deeper level of jhana and peacefulness, I did not claim that I was not distracted by sensuality. In other words, until he developed the Dhamma, he didn't claim anything. And it's true. The Buddha, when he left his home, his father's palace, at the age of 29, he was in a position to do great works in the locality he was in. In fact, his father wanted him to stay within the kingdom and eventually take over the throne. And Siddhartha Gautama would probably be one of the most well-loved leaders of all time. And he may have even gone down in history because he was an unawakened bodhisattva, meaning he was a human being imbued with this great compassion for other human beings. He simply didn't know how to apply it. That's why he called himself or referenced himself as an unawakened bodhisattva. Bodhisattva simply means a human being that has a deep compassion for other human beings. The myths and the vows that have developed over that are simply something the Buddha didn't teach. He recognized that a human being with great compassion, lacking in understanding of Four Noble Truths, can do an awful lot of damage in the world too. It's not enough. And just as reference, you can think of the Christian Crusades as a good example of that. But when I came to understand the stress, the despair, the drawback of sensual indulgence, and I had developed concentration and pleasure apart from sensual indulgence and unskillful mindfulness, or an even deeper level of jhana and peacefulness, then I did claim to not be distracted by sensuality. Once he established concentration and he was taking pleasure from his Dhamma practice, from his understanding. This next section and the last section I'll do tonight is called Understanding the Allure, the Drawback, and the Release of Clinging to Sensuality. And this is almost identical to last week's sutta, but just to put it into this context. Now, what is the allure of sensuality? There are 5 clinging fabrications of sensuality, 5 clinging aggregates. Forms interpreted by the eye as agreeable, pleasing, endearing, and enticing. No, I'm sorry, this is the 6th sense base. Sounds interpreted by the ears as agreeable, pleasing, endearing, and enticing. Aromas interpreted by the nose as agreeable, pleasing, endearing, and enticing. Flavors interpreted by the tongue as agreeable, pleasing, endearing, and enticing. Tactile sensations interpreted by the body as agreeable, pleasing, endearing, and enticing. Let me read my commentary. Here the Buddha is describing the immediate application of the understanding developed through the Eightfold Path at the point of contact with impermanent phenomena arising and passing away. So from a mind rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, coming into contact with the external world through the physical senses can only lead to further grasping, to further greed, aversion, and deluded thinking, because that's the foundation for what I'm interpreting, what's coming in contact with my senses. Is that understandable from everyone? And so when my thinking is still rooted in that way of thinking, if I'm still grasping after or still stuck in aversion in that way of thinking, rooted in ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, every single thought is developed from that point of view and can only continue that wrong view. But again, each moment, as we develop the Dhamma, as we integrate the Eightfold Path, each moment holds the potential to awaken, as long as our thinking is framed by the Eightfold Path. And so a well-concentrated mind, developing the refined mindfulness of the Eightfold Path, in this moment, as I'm coming into contact with the external world through these senses, the eye, ear, nose, and I'm starting to interpret what I'm seeing or what I'm smelling or what I'm hearing from wisdom, there's no eye making that follows from that. There's no craving initiated or clinging that follows. There's no maintaining. Each and every experience is new, it's meaningful, it's mindful, and there's nothing inside me to provoke the idea that I need this to be any different than it is, meaning more, less, or different in some way. Even when things change, remember the first, the Dukkha Sutta, there's 3 forms of stressfulness. There's the stress of form, of the physical body and the physical world. There's the stress of fabrications, or the stress of mental pain. And there's the stress of change. And it's clinging that causes the stress of change, doesn't it? Because I'm clinging to something to stay just as it is. But ultimately that resolves in my thoughts. And if I'm clinging to my self-referential thoughts to remain the same, I'm going to create great stress in my life, whether I'm in the Dhamma or not, because things always change, don't they? And that stress of change is going to be felt either in the form, in my physical body, or in my thinking, or through both. And it's usually both. But it's usually both with a mind that's outside of its body. So there's no resolution there. Friends, whatever pleasure or happiness that one establishes independence, on any of these 5 senses is a distracting allure of sensuality. Everybody got that? So the Buddha is really saying that until your mind is well concentrated, be very careful with what you're thinking and what you're attaching yourself to, because we literally cannot trust our thinking at that point. We can't, because we're operating from a view rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. We're in a class on Middle East politics, but we think we're in a cooking class. Lorna.
Well, it's not even at that point. I mean, it's all our thinking is deluded, all of it. And we misinterpret all,
Yes.
the feelings and the sensations and the tastes. And I mean,
Always.
it's all delusion.
Yep.
That's unnerving.
Well, and also remember, we're talking about in reference to the Buddha's Dhamma.
Right.
We're deluded about that. We're not deluded about human life, by the way. We all function pretty well, don't we? We got here we do all we need to do to live in the world. It's how we live in the world that we're ignorant of and deluded about. We simply don't know. This, again, thanks for the question, because it points us right back to Anatta, the not self characteristic. We simply don't understand who we are in relation to the world. That's the problem. That's what the Buddha means by Anatta. The common translation that Anatta means no self, and so we resolve ourselves into emptiness or nothingness, is the misunderstanding. We trace back all the way to the misunderstanding of how to interpret Anatta. The Buddha used a common term of his time, but in an uncommon way, much like he did with the word using karma or even metaphor like Mara. He used the word anatta to simply mean that the views you're holding of a self are not a self. They're wrong views. Let go of the views. They're not a self. That's all that anatta means. And Lorna is referring to that. So it's not that we're completely deluded about the world. We're not. But we're deluded about who we are in relation to the world. And that's where stress and suffering comes. That's where craving for and clinging to fabricated views arises from that. Thank you.
It doesn't get to be a problem until we realize how much stress we're under, which most people don't really realize that they are under constant stress.
That's what I was going to say when you first, I was going to argue with it.
Mm.
It is a problem all the time, but it's an unrecognized problem.
Right.
And most people spend their whole lives not recognizing that the underlying problem is ignorance. Most people take the underlying problem as I'm not getting what I want in this moment. Meaning we're taking everything personally.
Is there a point where you are developing your practice, and because you're developing, you recognize these delusions?
Yes, in fact, that's the point of the Dhamma, isn't it? So that we see it.
It's stressful to know that you're seeing flashes of understanding, and then knowing that you're delusional. So that could be stressful.
It
while you're
can.
developing
It can, as long as you're, if you're, especially if you're not being gentle, if you're judging yourself. Again, judging yourself is self-reference, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's self-identification with the problem. It's joining with the problem. As the Buddha, a lot of modern teachings say we should join or embrace our suffering and all that nonsense. I don't mean to call it nonsense. I'm sorry. It's nonsense in the Dhamma. If you're engaged in that practice, that's fine. The Buddha does not teach us to embrace or join with our suffering. He teaches to understand our suffering. In fact, he teaches us to understand the nature of suffering so we don't join with it, so we don't identify with it, so we see it for what it is. All suffering is completely impersonal, all of it. Even if somebody hits me in the head with a brick, there's nothing personal about it, is there? Even if he calls me by name, there's nothing personal. Well, because my understanding is that he hit me in the head with a brick because of his own ignorance. I can't take it personal. And if I do, it's not his fault that I'm taking it personal, is it? It's my fault. And again, if I'm around somebody who likes to hit people in the head with the bricks, what I'm likely going to do as an awakened human being is not spend too much association with that person.
Right.
But that's it. It's not. He's not the world's biggest so-and-so because of it, because of how he acts. He's somebody recognized as a difficult person. I'm not going to spend too much time around him, and if I do, I'll probably wear a football helmet.
So this is the thing, is that who is awakening? Who is awakening? The Buddha didn't teach awakening. The Buddha taught understanding of suffering and the cessation of suffering. That's it.
Yeah, and he would always say, and nothing more.
Hindrances occur.
Yeah,
And
it's
as we understand suffering, our own suffering of our own making, and understand the cessation of that suffering, who's awakened? Matt? Me? Some guy whose name is XYZ? That guy's awakening? So we have to think, we have to look at that a little bit. It's this is
Well, I was thinking about what Lorna said, as I often do, and the conversation you had about how everybody's deluded. But the way I look at it is sort of like what David was alluding to, in that through the Dhamma, we've learned to be more aware of the Eightfold Path. And so what I do is I recognize when I stepped off it, which is just as brilliant as recognizing improvement. And then that goes to the top of the next day. So if I didn't do too well, say I didn't have right speech or right view, or I got hung up on something, okay, there, today I recognize it, tomorrow I work on it. And so much